After this year's presidential preference primary in Missouri, some want state lawmakers to return the process to state control.
Well, this year was the first election cycle under a party-run primary system. Capitol Bureau Chief Joe McLean reports from Jefferson City on the growing dissatisfaction over that change.
Presidential preference primaries happen in March in Missouri, and they've historically been run by the Secretary of State's office, just like every other election. But that changed 2 years ago. Missouri's president picking process is now administered by the parties themselves instead of the state government.
The clerks obviously didn't like having two elections within 30 days of each other because of some logistical concerns and evidentiary concerns if there are concerns or problems or audits that there was also the concern about the cost.
A cost, Ashcroft says, of about $10 million. And the new system also allowed the parties to only let registered members take part. Missouri Republicans moved to a caucus system where participants gather in county-level party meetings to choose the candidate through either secret ballots or a public showing of support. But those meetings happen on one day and in key locations, making participation and access far more challenging. The backlash was fierce.
I've probably had more complaints from constituents over this issue than anything that I've done or not done in the past 6 years.
State Representative Ben Baker, a Republican, is one of several lawmakers from both parties who filed a bill to reverse the changes and return those early primaries to state control.
I think the way this has played out, that the caucus system really does disenfranchise voters.
Meanwhile, Missouri's Democratic Party organized a statewide election for its March primary, but ranking member on the House Elections Committee, Representative Joe Adams, said it wasn't as well resourced as an election run by the state government.
But I would like everybody to have the opportunity to have a say in who the presidential candidate will be that they will vote for in November. I want people to participate.
With less than a month left in the legislative session, it's less likely that this policy change will get across the finish line, but it's also not a pressing deadline, as there are 2 more sessions before Missourians would have to vote on another presidential candidate in 2028. In Jefferson City, Joe McLean, WGEM News.